The cryptic message left by Leonor that left the royal family silent. There was one moment this week that caught my attention more than any official statement, more than any palace appearance, and honestly, more than most of the headlines. It wasn't a speech. It wasn't a ceremony. It wasn't even a major royal event. It was a message. A short message. The kind of message that seems completely harmless at first glance. But the more people looked at it, the more questions it created. And perhaps the most surprising part. Nobody from the royal family seemed eager to explain it. Silence. Just silence. And when a royal family chooses silence instead of clarification, that's usually when the real story begins. Because here's something I've learned after following royal families for years. The most important things are rarely the things they officially announce. The most important things are often hidden inside the details everyone else ignores. A phrase, a gesture, a look, or in this case, a message. And today, I want to talk about why this message from Princess Leonor has created so much speculation, why people are reading between the lines, and why I think the reaction tells us something much bigger about her future. Before we get into it, if you're new to Leonor's story, subscribe. I post every day. Because this story isn't really about one message. It's about what happens when a future queen starts finding her own voice. And that's where things get interesting. Now let's talk about the message itself. Not because the words were shocking. Actually, the opposite. The words were surprisingly simple. But context changes everything. A sentence can mean one thing when spoken by an ordinary person. It can mean something completely different when spoken by someone expected to become queen one day. That's the burden of royal life. Every word carries weight. Every appearance gets analyzed. Every decision becomes a headline. And Leonor knows this. Which is exactly why I don't believe anything she communicates publicly is accidental. That's my first hot take. I think people often underestimate her. They still see a young royal. I think the palace increasingly sees a future institution. There's a difference, and that difference matters. When I watched reactions unfold, I noticed something fascinating. Some commentators treated the message as routine. Others acted as if it contained a hidden meaning. But what if both sides are missing the point? What if the significance isn't what she said? What if it's why she said it now? That's the question I keep coming back to. Timing. Timing changes everything. Because royal communications are rarely random. Especially in an era where every post, statement, and appearance is carefully managed. So when a message suddenly captures public attention, I always ask. Why now? Why this moment? Why this wording? And who benefits from the conversation that follows? Sometimes the answers reveal more than the message itself. One thing I've noticed recently is that Leonor's public image is evolving. A few years ago, she was often presented as the protected daughter of the king and queen. Today, the narrative feels different. Now we're seeing someone being prepared for leadership. Someone expected to stand independently. Someone expected to carry responsibility. And with that shift comes something royal families often struggle with. Control. How much freedom should the future queen have? How much individuality is acceptable? How much personality can be shown before it starts creating complications? These are difficult questions, because history shows that monarchies often want modernity and tradition at the same time. They want authenticity, but they also want predictability. And those two things don't always work together. That's one reason I think Leonor fascinates so many people. She represents a generation that grew up differently. A generation that values direct communication. A generation that expects transparency. Yet she's entering one of the world's most traditional institutions. Just think about that contradiction. It's huge. And maybe that's why even a small message can create such a large reaction. Because people aren't just analyzing the words. They're analyzing what those words say about the future. Now here's another angle nobody talks about enough. The media's reaction. Whenever something involving Leonor gains attention, I always pay close attention to what different outlets emphasize. Not just what they report. What they emphasize. Because emphasis reveals priorities. Some focused on the message itself. Others focused on public reactions. Others immediately connected it to larger questions about the monarchy. And that's where things become interesting. Because suddenly we're no longer discussing a message. We're discussing symbolism. We're discussing expectations. We're discussing succession. And that's a much bigger conversation. In some ways, this reminds me of how people analyze members of the British royal family. Look at how every gesture from Prince William or Catherine gets dissected. People aren't simply observing individuals. They're trying to understand institutions through individuals. The same thing is increasingly happening with Leonor. Every appearance becomes a clue. Every statement becomes evidence. Every silence becomes a story. And honestly, sometimes I think silence generates more headlines than speaking. Which brings us back to the royal family's response. Or lack of response. The silence itself became part of the narrative. And whenever that happens, speculation rushes in to fill the gap. That's human nature. People want explanations. They want certainty. They want answers. But royal families often operate differently. Sometimes they believe saying less protects more. Sometimes they're right. Sometimes they're not. What fascinates me is how Leonor seems increasingly comfortable allowing people to draw their own conclusions. That requires confidence. It requires patience. And perhaps most importantly, it requires understanding that public perception can't be controlled forever. Now here's my personal analysis. And this is just my interpretation. I think this entire episode reveals something important about Leonor's evolution. Not the message, not the headlines, the evolution. She appears more comfortable occupying the spotlight without chasing it. That's a difficult balance. Many public figures spend enormous energy trying to attract attention. Leonor increasingly seems focused on managing attention. That's a very different skill. And potentially a very important one for the future. Because modern monarchy isn't just about ceremonies. It's about narrative. It's about trust. It's about understanding when to speak and when to remain silent. And every year, Leonor appears to be learning those lessons. Another comparison comes to mind. Think about someone like Mr. Beast. Stay with me here. At first, that comparison sounds ridiculous. But there is a lesson. The reason Mr. Beast became so influential wasn't because he talked the most. It was because people became interested in what he might do next. Anticipation became part of the brand. In a completely different way, anticipation is becoming part of Leonor's public image too. People watch, people wait, people speculate, and that attention creates influence. Not because every message contains secrets, but because people believe it might. That's powerful, and it's something very few public figures achieve. So what have we actually learned from this entire situation? For me, there are 3 big lessons. First, public fascination with Leonor is growing, not shrinking. A simple message doesn't generate this level of discussion unless people are deeply invested in the person behind it. Second, the future queen is gradually stepping into a more independent public role. You can feel that transition happening. Maybe not dramatically, but steadily. And third, the royal family faces a challenge every modern monarchy faces. How do you remain mysterious enough to be interesting while staying transparent enough to remain trusted? That balance isn't easy, and every generation has to find its own answer. Perhaps that's the real story here. Not a cryptic message, not a hidden meaning, not a palace secret, but a glimpse into a future queen learning how to communicate in a world that analyzes everything. And maybe that's why this moment matters. Because one day, people may look back and realize this wasn't really about what Leonor said. It was about the moment people started paying attention to every word she says. And those are 2 very different stories. What do you think? Was this message simply being overanalyzed? Or was it one of those rare royal moments where the silence afterward said more than the words themselves? I'd genuinely love to hear your perspective. Because when it comes to royal stories, the most interesting answers are often hidden between the lines.